I'm I am an NCD child young leader, Joab Wako, and I'd like to welcome you to an awareness-raising podcast, Stand Up, Speak Out, where we aim to tackle stigma and discrimination of people, specifically youth, living with non-communicable diseases and their caretakers. The World Health Organization defines non-communicable diseases, or NCDs, also known as chronic diseases, as those with a long duration and are the result of a combination of genetic, psychological, and environmental behavioral factors. And the four main types of NCDs are heart disease, cancer, respiratory diseases, diabetes, and also rare conditions. In early 2021, we NCDChild young leaders in the People Living with NCDs Technical Working Group created an online survey which served as a consultative process to gauge whether youth living with NCDs had experienced stigma and discrimination and the preferred platform to voice these experiences. And a majority of participants indicated that participating in a podcast series would be the preferred platform to amplify their voices. Guided by this consultation, the Stand Up, Speak Out podcast series aims to understand the lived experiences of young people living with NCDs and highlights the experiences of stigma and discrimination, a neglected issue within the realm of NCD advocacy. Like I said, I'm Joab Wako. I've been living with chronic kidney disease for the last 8 years. And I was lucky to get a kidney transplant 7 years ago from my older sister. And that completely changed my life. And it inspired me to tell my story and to get into NCD advocacy. And I'm a very passionate young leader. And I'm so excited to be joined on this episode by Jean. And Jean, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Of course. Thank you so much, Joab. Hi, everyone. My name is Jean Langford, and thank you so much for having me on this today. It's a privilege. So I have lived with type 1 diabetes for 17 years, and I am 27 years old. So yeah, I am really, really passionate about advocating for people living with all types of diabetes. I'm a DDoC voice. I've been in the Youth Leadership Lab with IDF Europe. That's the International Diabetes Federation of Europe. And I'm an advocate in Scotland currently, where I'm doing a master's in dietetics to become a diabetes dietitian. So I currently do a lot of advocacy work, and I'm lead volunteer for Diabetes Scotland. And I advocate back in Ireland also for better services, access to care and technology with Midwest diabetes.
Wow, thank you so much, Jean, for that introduction and the amazing work you're doing. So I think first it would be, I guess, interesting to delve into a bit of your story. So if you're comfortable sharing, could you tell us what NCD you're living with, but more about your story, perhaps how you found out. I know it's type 1, so yeah, just kind of dive into your story a bit more.
Yeah, sure, happy to. So I was diagnosed with type 1 when I was 11 years old. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition where your beta cells are destroyed and the body no longer produces insulin. So my immune system basically went into a bit too much of overdrive when I got some kind of virus or infection and attacked my own beta cells that produces insulin. For me, I believe it was hereditary. It's very dominant in my family. My granddad had it and my uncle had it also. And I have 2 cousins with it also. But it can happen to anyone. Statistics are showing now that people are getting type 1 diabetes without any family history of this condition. So yeah, for me, I lived with it for years in silence. I didn't feel like I could really talk about it. I felt like type 1 diabetes was just one of these things that I had to get on with, and didn't feel comfortable talking about the reality of living with it. From the outside, I'd always look totally fine, no matter what my blood sugars were. So it was easy to keep a secret, the struggle of living with it. So it was only when I got a bit older that I felt comfortable chatting about it and talking about the reality of living with it, and advocating for access to care and technology when I became aware of services I should have been availing of my whole life that I wasn't. So yeah, that's my story in short. That's a whistle stop tour of it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Maybe I can take you into that moment when you said you're 11 years old, because myself, I was diagnosed with chronic kidney disease when I was 24 years old. And I just remember being in the hospital room and there were so many doctors around me and I didn't understand what was happening. And then the head of the renal department in the hospital where I was diagnosed came and asked me if I know what the kidneys do. And so when I was like, okay, I know what the kidneys do, this is the basics of it. And that was his way of breaking the news to me that my kidneys are shut down. At the time, they didn't know if it was chronic or if it was acute. And so he started just telling me about kidney health and what the kidneys do in the body. And then he said that my kidneys had shut down, but they weren't sure if it was chronic or acute. And so that's when now my world was like, okay, I need to research more about kidneys. And I just remember like my whole world stopped at that point. If you ask me the details of that day, I cannot remember. I just know that I was like in a daze almost because I just didn't expect it. I wasn't feeling well and I knew I was sick, but when I was told how severe it was, it just stopped my world. So do you remember the day you were told? Like, how did you, like, who told you? How did they break the news? Because that's a big factor in how people take the news, though, the diagnosis of living with an NCD. So I'm a bit curious, like, how were you told? Do you remember the day and what happened that day?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny the way you're talking about, because you were diagnosed at 24, right? So you were like an adult diagnosed, and I have a lot of friends who are diagnosed with type 1 as an adult, and it's so interesting hearing the differences of being diagnosed as an adult versus a child with any non-communicable chronic disease, because it's up to the person to take initiative to do that research. Whereas for me as a child being diagnosed, it never came to even my mind that I would research this illness. It just wasn't on the forefront of my mind. When I was diagnosed on the day, I actually nearly where ketones showed up, and he did a blood sugar test as well. But up until that point, I was about to be dismissed and kind of sent away with just a kind of stomach flu. And when it showed that I had type 1, I remember my parents' reaction before I remember my own. My parents knew about type 1, having that family history. So I remember them being very upset. And it took me a few minutes to kind of register what was going on. And I still hadn't registered in the car to the hospital that I had type 1 and that I was just diagnosed. I was only crying kind of reactively, just to everyone else's reaction, really. But I couldn't process what it was, or like I'd seen my granddad check his blood sugars, and that's all I knew of it, really. But I was just upset that I had something and that I was sick and that my parents were upset. Actually processing what type 1 was wasn't even for a good few years, I'd say. I think it was like really kept I was very much kept in bubble wrap with it. I was told constantly it would be manageable. I'd live a very full life. I would live very well with all this, and I wasn't really made aware of like complications or any issues that could arise with type 1. I was very much told I was the same as everyone else, even though I had this whole list of things to do and this whole new burden basically to live with, which it was initially, especially for my parents, but I think they really shielded me from that and took over so much of the management. So for my initial diagnosis, definitely very upset. I was completely just sad that I was sick, really, and that I was in hospital. But in terms of the diagnosis, I think I really didn't experience my diagnosis until I was about 2021 when I was living abroad. And for the first time, I was around people constantly and around I wasn't around my support system. So for the first time I was very aware of how much this was my illness and I would live with this for the rest of my life. And then I felt like I was having my second diagnosis almost of the reality of what living with a chronic disease is. So yeah, for my first one, it was around for my first diagnosis, sorry, it sounds a bit strange, but for on my initial diagnosis, I was just upset that people were upset and that this was happening, but not fully aware of what was going on until I got a bit older and realized the actual reality of living with a chronic disease, and especially type 1 diabetes, where there's so much management involved 24/7.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And it's important that you mentioned the management and how your parents kind of took that initially for you because you were a teenager, and then you kind of now taking that over and kind of now really facing the reality of living as an adult with type 1 diabetes. Because for me, after I was diagnosed and told that it's chronic and I needed a kidney transplant at that time, there were medications I had to take even when I was on dialysis that it was just so much information. So I even remember going for my first dialysis session, and the nurse there was kind of, informing me what's going to happen. And it was just so much, I didn't know what to do with it, and at that time I'm already an adult, so I'm the one who has to be responsible for my health. And I was overwhelmed, and when it dawned on me, I think I kind of got a bit depressed about it, because this was for the rest of my life. There was no getting better, there was no it's gonna stop, it's just gonna be continuous until I die. So that coming to that realization is, I guess, the impact of the management, the weight, the burden, and even medications. And maybe we can go into medications right now. And for me, the medications on dialysis and even post-transplant are so many that I think when I was just transplanted, I had 13 different medications, and the nurses were there in the room telling me, okay, this is what this does, this is what that does. And the first day, I think I got like 2 of them. And then they would come the next day and do the same thing, because they had to basically take over my medication regime, like when I was in hospital, because 13 different medications all in one day, it's very hard to keep up. So I'm curious, on your end, transitioning from your parents, kind of managing your type 1 for you, if I can say that, and then you taking over when you're an adult. How was that transition for you? How did you manage it? And yeah, how did you cope with it?
As you're talking about the medications, I'm just completely relating. Like, it's so overwhelming getting all that information, and like this new itinerary that you have for your daily schedule to implement, along with doing everything everyone else does in their normal daily life. So I really hear you there. Yeah, for me taking over that, it was difficult initially. I know for my mom especially, she had really been such a huge part in managing my diabetes. She played a huge role there, and she really didn't make me aware of what was fully going on, I suppose, that she was doing, which retrospectively would have been actually really great to have been a part of it from day dot, because once I decided to take over, which there was never really a formal discussion about, it's just I realized when I was abroad that I would need to be able to manage this completely on my own, be able to do all my prescription orders monthly, be able to have that to hand all the time, and be able to get emergency supplies when necessary. It was difficult for her to let go of it, and it was also quite overwhelming for me to take it all on and try to do it all on my own. I think living with a chronic illness, I know for myself anyway, I have become a bit hyper independent. I really don't want people to be a part of my care anymore, because I find it stressful to have other people a part of it. I feel that, it's my responsibility to do it all, when in actual fact people would love to help and love to relieve some of that burden, and it's something that they really don't feel as a burden to them. But for myself personally, I definitely struggled with taking it all on, not letting people in to help, and just trying to do it all on my own. And it's something that I'm trying to gradually accept, that I can accept help again with this and not do it all alone. But there was definitely this kind of messy middle in my 20s where I was doing all of the phone calls for the pharmacy orders. I was taking so much initiative in my care generally. I was self-learning for the first time. So before that, I was just taking the information I was getting at doctor's appointments and going with that, and not taking any initiative to adjust my healthcare for me. And there's this statistic that's thrown around with type 1 diabetes, that we spend 98.88% of the time with our diabetes on our own. There's that other tiny percentage that we spend with healthcare professionals, but yet we rely on them solely to design our entire management practices for our diabetes and to help us with our dosing and everything like that. And of course, we seek medical consultancy for every type of changes that we're making to our insulin doses or our insulin types. But we have to really, I suppose, take initiative with our own healthcare and react to things on a daily basis and make changes that suit us. Otherwise, if we stayed on these ratios and doses that our doctors prescribe for us daily, that simply wouldn't work. It needs to be adaptive to our daily lifestyle. So yeah, it was only in my 20s that I really took that initiative to I suppose take the responsibilities away from my parents that they had been taking on up until that point. I still reach out for help a good bit when I need to, but and then B, just looking into my healthcare myself and what I need to do to make sure I can actually live well with diabetes. So yeah, it was definitely a journey.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, what was resonating in my mind is that we're experts as well. Like we're the ones who live with the condition, as you said, 98% of the time. We're not with doctors or with our caregivers. We're the ones who are feeling and living every day with the condition. So it's important that we take the lead in that. You know, we take ownership. And another thing that popped up is that when they're confident in your experience as well. You know, a doctor has read and they know the knowledge, but we are the ones who are experiencing it. So we need to be able to feel confident enough to tell the doctor, hey, this medication or this dose doesn't work for me. If there's something else we can do, even though it's the best course, you know, this I kind of negotiation, if I can say. And that's how I look at it, is that when I get to when I go to my doctor, I'm like, yo, it's not working for me. There has to be something, you know. I've become a lot more confident in my feelings rather than the doctor just telling me, do this, do this, do this. And then I'm the one struggling with, you know, my blood pressure or there's something off. And they're just telling me that's my best regimen for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely needs to be a two-way conversation where it's the person, you know, we have to drive it every single day and we need to know how to stop the car and check the tires and do the checks and the windscreen wipers. And like, not only do we need to know how to check those, we need to know how to change them if necessary, or where to go to change them if necessary. And like, our driving instructor doesn't sit in our car with us every day for the rest of our life when we pass our driving test. And it's the same with a chronic disease or a chronic illness. Like, we are completely driving this car. The car is our body, and we need to know how to look out for those things and how to adapt to those things and make sure that we can get through our day. If we waited on that doctor appointment, like I called yesterday for a doctor's appointment, and it wouldn't be till the end of April that I get to see that doctor. So I mean, if I was to wait 5 weeks to make changes to what I need support with right now, it just wouldn't work out. It's nothing urgent, thankfully, but I mean, if it was, I'd really need to know what to do myself. So yeah, we're definitely the drivers of our own car.
Well said. Maybe we can delve deeper into management and more specifically medication. For me, and I'd like to hear your opinion or your experience. Here in Kenya, they don't pay for any of my post-transplant medication. So I have to pay out of pocket for that. And it's very expensive. So I end up importing my medication from India because I'm on generic medication just to save a bit of money. So it's very difficult to manage because I have to buy in bulk, like in 3 to 6 months of medication. And then when I do go see my doctor, maybe 3 months at a go, if he changes anything, I have to now, you know, react kind of months later because my medication, although it's available locally, it's very expensive here in Kenya to buy the medication. So I'm curious to hear about your experience in your country. How is insurance for type 1 diabetes and the medication you take? Does it pay for the consultations? Do they pay for the medication and accessibility as well?
Wow, sorry, that is so frustrating to hear that you have to pay for your medication. It drives me crazy to hear that in different countries people are paying for medications or having to go to those extremes as well of ordering from a different country to get what you need. It just doesn't make sense to me. In Ireland, luckily, we do have access to our medication for type 1 diabetes. We have a long-term illness book, where our medications are listed on that long-term illness book and we have access to that. However, the issue really lies in the fact that we have real challenges in accessing the actual healthcare providers and in accessing education on how to take our medication. So for type 1 diabetes, we really, really need structured education on how to take insulin. We need to know how to dose that insulin, excuse me, and we need to know how to understand our bodies better to take insulin accordingly. There's 42 known factors which affect blood sugar and how insulin is absorbed and used. So if we don't have that education and information on how to take insulin, taking insulin itself can be absolutely lethal. Like if you take a few drops too much, you can suffer from a severe low blood sugar, which you can go unconscious from. And if you don't take enough insulin and have hyperglycemia, which is high blood sugar for days on end, you can get you can just be a lot more likely to get a lot of different complications over your lifetime. So things like heart disease and kidney disease and neuropathy, issues with your eyesight, and a whole multitude of other issues. Autoimmune conditions tend to go hand in hand as well. So it's really, really imperative that people have access to the education and healthcare support to actually take insulin correctly. At the moment in Limerick, while people can get their insulin for free and they can access that, which is incredible, people waiting for a first-time appointment in our local hospital, the waiting list is, I think, 800, over 800 people. I think it's 862, around that figure, and the waiting list is 5 years for a first-time appointment to see a specialist on actually how to learn how to take your insulin and what doses you should be on. And half of that waiting list are people who are newly diagnosed. So it's a weird situation where, while we're very grateful to have access to the basics like insulin, accessing healthcare is a huge issue, and also accessing the most recent available technology is an issue as well, where people have to self-fund for continuous glucose monitors or flash glucose monitors unless they meet certain criteria. So people are paying about €120 a month minimum out of pocket for sensors, which are hugely life-saving in terms of diabetes management and preventing high and low blood sugars with taking insulin. So we have our pros and our cons list, but there's so much work to be done, as there is in every country, with with access to healthcare and healthcare supplies and healthcare education.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why the work that you're doing, I'm sure, is like so important, you know, like the things that are available, but we still have a long way to go. Yeah, maybe I'll shift a bit if that's okay. So growing up with diabetes type 1, have you ever felt discriminated or stigmatized because of your condition?
So I was really lucky growing up, like in school and yeah, through primary school and secondary school. I was very lucky in that people were very supportive. I didn't experience stigma, I would say, until I was in my 20s, just throughout university. It was just challenging being around people living with diabetes, and people didn't understand why I maybe couldn't show up to everything, or why I was, I suppose, unwell quite a lot. Even in school, actually, now that I reflect a bit more, I suppose there was a lot of stigma around me missing school. You know, people thought maybe I was just like dossing off school and not going in for the fun of it, even though I was really, really sick. And now statistics show that like children with type 1 diabetes miss on average 9 school days per year, because of the lack of sleep and because of treating low and high blood sugars and being a bit more susceptible to infections. So while I didn't experience stigma around diabetes itself, I suppose around the way I presented and people didn't fully understand it, and why maybe I wasn't able to show up in ways that other people could. And it's something I struggled with through college as well. But I do know that stigma absolutely does exist for so many other people, and they maybe don't have people in their family with that family history, so that their family didn't have a better understanding of it. And I know even actually, I will say for my sisters, they didn't fully understand it until recent years. So they would have been quite confused by the management of it, because I think a condition like diabetes, the word manageable is often thrown around, and that people living with diabetes just manage it and get on with it. And then if people see people living with diabetes maybe taking that time off, or going through a higher low blood sugar, which is completely a normal part of a person's day with diabetes, to have those high low blood sugars. I mean, if we didn't have them, we'd be cured. And I think if people see people having those, they think, oh, they're not managing it. And yeah, it's an interesting one. The stigma I've never felt directed towards me. People have often told me, "Oh my God, you do such a good job. Like you really manage it so well." But I know this person with diabetes, and they do X, Y, Z. I saw them eat a crunchy. I saw them have a Lucozade, and I'll always push them a little bit. I'll be like, "Oh, that's really interesting. Do you know much about diabetes? Do you know if maybe they were having a low blood sugar? Do you know if maybe they were about to exercise? Do you know anything about why they were eating what they were eating? And do you feel qualified to comment on someone's dietary choices with a chronic illness?" I don't go that far into it, but I do just kind of, question them a bit. And I'm like, and why do you think they might have been doing that? And how do you think you'd feel if you lived with this? And people, yeah, the stigma and judgment I felt hasn't been directed towards me directly, but people have made comments on other people living with diabetes, um, that they might not even know that well, and their management based on a tiny snapshot they saw of them on a given day. And I like to develop those conversations and kind of probe and see where it goes, and kind of educate them a bit without them realizing.
Well, yeah, and I keep hearing like it's more ignorance, and what you're doing is you're educating them, you're like enlightening them about type 1 diabetes, which is such a good way of dealing with it. Because even for me, a lot of the stigma and discrimination I faced was based off ignorance and just not knowing more about the condition. So it wasn't intentional. It's more like they just don't know, and they say things or do things that are maybe not the best way to do it, but it's not coming from a malicious place. It's just that they don't know. So it does take a lot to educate.
Completely. I totally hear you. It's like I would never expect people to know everything about diabetes or everything about kidney disease. It's, everyone has their own thing, and everyone has their own family history of some form of illness or grievance, and they're expert in that. And it's definitely never from a place of malice when they pass comments on different illnesses. My only issue is when they pass comments plain expert. So I have no problem someone saying, you know what, I know nothing about that illness. And I wish people would say this more. I wish people would say, I actually know nothing about it. And then just leave it there and not pass comment on the person that they've seen living with it. It's when people feel that they can be like, should they be eating that? Shouldn't they be eating that? As far as I'm aware from that one advertisement I saw on this chronic illness, they should not be doing X, Y, Z. And that's where I suppose I feel it's time to have a chat and, reconsider what messages people are taking in, and whether those are the right messages to be taking in, and just to challenge them a bit further.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So as we wrap up, in your opinion, how can we change the way patients living with NCDs are discriminated against, or the situations they're put in? How can we change or improve the situations you've gone through, in your opinion?
For me, I think peer support has been absolutely pivotal in my experience of living with diabetes. Peer support is actually why I'm here, because it wasn't until I reached out and found peer support and spoke with people who really understood what I was going through that I felt I could advocate for myself. Up until that point, I suppose I really didn't feel like I was in a position to advocate for myself. It felt selfish. But once I realized other people were going through similar things, I felt a lot more comfortable knowing that it wasn't my individual experience or my individual, that I wasn't failing by not, I suppose, living certain ways with type 1 diabetes. And when I found peer support, I was able to really feel a lot more human living with type 1 diabetes. And the peer support, I suppose, for me, really just changed my entire experience, in that I was able to recognize so many similarities that we were living with. Whereas when I was talking to people who didn't live with this, it wasn't quite the same, and things could often be minimized or negated, and not validated. So I think providing peer support for people living with chronic illnesses is so important as part of their care. And it means that when people are actually in those groups, they feel a lot more comfortable talking about it to other people. That's what happened in my experience. It was when I realized that it wasn't just me going through this. I felt comfortable talking to other people about it and educating people about it when I wasn't just speaking for myself. So yeah, I really think encouraging people to seek peer support and to reach out to their community of people going through the same thing can really help.
Thank you so much, Jean, for that insight. It is not easy to talk about stigma, and stigma can look and be perceived differently by individuals. Your story is yours and it matters. Thank you for listening in. We hope that this has provided insights to the difficult experiences people and youth living with NCDs have to grapple with. This is only a small step towards addressing the issue, but we hope that you will join us as the NCDChild young leaders to tackle stigma and discrimination. We encourage you to have a listen to the entire series. We would love to hear from you and what you think. You can also visit our website at ncdchild.org for more information, or if you'd like to reach out. On behalf of our team, Puva, Alex, Shakira, Bolindi, and myself, we'd like to thank you. We'd like to thank our amazing guest, Jean, for sharing her lived experiences and proving how important it is to include our voices as young people. We know that speaking out is not easy, but your voice is powerful and much needed. We hope that this inspires our listeners to stand up and speak out against stigma and discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you so much.